Welcome, members, friends, and new listeners to the Global Justice Report, an online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand, your host today. Glad to have you with us. The Center for Global Justice is a multinational and bilingual research center in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world. Since 2004, we've been offering educational programs in English for expats and visitors, and programs in Spanish for the larger community. We've also organized educational travel to Chiapas and to Cuba. Our vision is to move control of economic life and relations with Mother Earth from the 1% to the 99%. Coronavirus has set in relief the failures of neoliberal capitalism. Our weekly Global Justice Report will explore various grassroots democratic solutions, a variety of issues. This is our 29th webinar since we initiated them June 1. And all past webinars are available on our website. In case you missed them, check out the list of what's available, because it's really very exciting. Today's webinar is related to the election. We want to look at the way forward. Most progressives had hoped and even expected that we would see a blue wave, and had thought that that election day would look something like this. A lone Trump supporter surrounded by a sea of blue. Well, it did not turn out that way, unfortunately. Even though the Democratic candidate won, it was by a significant popular vote margin. But the hope of the left had been that by supporting Biden, we'd be able to move his administration in a more progressive direction. Unless Democrats can get 2 more senators out of the January 5th runoff in Georgia, that's looking to be more difficult than we thought. Our question today is, what is the way forward for progressive change in the US? What strategy do we need? What is the terrain for our struggle? What issues should we focus on? These are among the questions our panel will address today. We're happy to have back with us Jeff Faux. He gave one of our earlier webinars back in June on the topic, Can Democrats Defeat the Fascist Threat? Topic that is still current. Jeff is a frequent speaker for the Center for Global Justice, founder of the Economic Policy Institute. His most recent book is The Servant Economy. Laura Carlsen is also familiar to our audiences in San Miguel. A Mexico City-based journalist, Laura is director of the Americas program. She's often called on as a knowledgeable commentator on Mexican affairs and US-Mexican relations. Unfortunately, Leo Panitch is unable to join us today. He's been laid up by a spinal injury. We wish him a speedy recovery. We also hope to have Frances Fox Piven with us today, but she hasn't signed on yet, but hopefully she will in the course of this webinar. So for now, let me just turn the floor over to Jeff Faux, who will be our first speaker. Basically, the format is we ask each of our speakers to give a 10-minute or so overview of their assessment of where we're at and what is the way forward. And then we'll have dialogue between the speakers, followed then by your questions and comments. So, Jeff, take it away.
Well, thank you, Cliff, and thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Well, let me start by saying I woke up the day after Election Day in 2020, with the same question I woke up with in 2016, which was, given this preposterous Donald Trump, how is it possible that it was even close? And as you said, this time at least, we dodged the bullet. But the Senate is probably not within reach. We lost seats in the House. The Democrats did not pick up any states so that the legislatures could change, which means that the Republicans will pretty much dominate the redistricting that's going to take place for the next to influence the elections of the next decade. And the most possibly amazing thing of all, Trump's share of the popular vote rose. He got a larger share against this time after his disastrous performance against Biden than he did against Hillary. Also note that the Democrats outspent the Republicans. Biden raised more money, and as far as I can see from the numbers down ballot in the Senate races and most of the House races, the Democrats were not, as they have been in the past, sort of outgunned financially. They had more money. As a matter of fact, Trump in the last few weeks was running short of cash. Now, there's a lot of finger pointing, and we could spend the next 3 days arguing about, what was the thing that moved this amount of votes in that state or that amount of votes in that state. In elections with that are relatively narrow, everything counts. Everything is a generator of what happened. But I want to concentrate on what I think is, for me at least, currently the basic conundrum that this election underscores. Ideologically, the Democratic left, its agenda is more popular than any time since the Great Society. I mean, we have 60 to 70% of the people in favor of government guaranteed health care, green investments, a wealth tax, $15 minimum wage, stopping police brutality. It's extraordinary. And certainly in my lifetime, as I say, the only time I've seen anything like this was back in the 1960s. But politically, the left has failed again. And by, I mean, again, the Democratic Party left could not choose the nominee. Sanders and Warren lost. Biden took many of the ideas from the left for his campaign plank, but you can't even call his victory a particularly smashing one. Yes, I know many of my friends say, well, of course, Biden was not from the left. He really didn't get, well, that's true for us. But for most people who go and vote, there was the left of Biden and the right Trump. So for most people, Biden was the left. And despite the despicable performance of Trump, in many, many ways, it'll take another 3 days to go through each of them, Biden barely won. So what I conclude from this is that the left's agenda is appealing. The problem is it's not credible. And I think that that's that's an important thing to concentrate on. So let me give you a list of things that I think about in coming to that conclusion. Most Americans are working class. They work, they have to work for a living in order to put bread on the table, to pay the mortgage or rent, keep their kids in shoes. Even before COVID, as most of us know, wages and opportunities were declining and deteriorating for American workers. This was, ironically, something that the left picked up a long time ago. People like ourselves have been talking about it for more than a decade. But it wasn't the left that took advantage of this. It was the right. It was Trump and who exploited this, and in 4 short years turned the Republican Party into a right-wing populist working class base political party. And it was able, of course, in this process to turn the anger about the economic situation into racism, misogyny, xenophobia, etc. We know that story. At the same time, throughout this whole campaign, Donald Trump has registered more favorable on economic issues and jobs than Biden and the Democrats. Throughout the whole campaign. Now, part of that was a reasonably or apparently robust economy that was an extension of what Obama had started and was goosed up by these trickle-down tax cuts for corporations and rich people. But he remained, and despite a lot of news on that, Trump remained more favorable on jobs. And there was something I came across the other day, which struck me. A poll that Pew took showed that among evangelicals, jobs were the most important political issue, even more than abortion. Now, I don't know how if that's been replicated. I looked for that, but Pew is a pretty reputable research organization. Okay, so at the same time, the Democrats say, hey, wait a minute, we're the party of the working people. And that's the reputation they like to think they have. But if you look closely and you look at it from the perspective of a voter who doesn't spend a lot of time thinking about politics, but just looks at the impressions that these people give, it becomes pretty clear that the message from the Democrats is that their future lies with suburban whites, liberals, and minorities. So, for example, Black Lives Matter, as we all remember in the spring and the fall, the demonstrations and the response to that seemed to us like it was a wave of progressive sentiment in the country. And it was. The murder of George Floyd was struck even a majority of whites as reprehensible. And there was a lot of support for Black Lives Matter. But after the 2 or 3 months of demonstrations, that support dropped measurably, even among African Americans. So there are pieces of information here that we need to absorb. And defunding the police, while it seemed like an exciting idea to a lot of people on the left, was a dud. It scared people. Even again, it scared people in minority communities who live in high crime areas. So another piece of this is the improvement of Trump among minorities. In Texas, he got something like 42% of the Latino vote. He improved among African-American males and he got almost 20% of that vote. So what's going on here? One of the things that may be going on is that minorities, like most Americans, but even more so, are working class people. They work for a living. And so it's not totally surprising that at some point they begin to vote like working class people. The Democratic, I have to make a note of this, a technical note. There's a lot of assumption that goes along about the future of white and non-white ethnicity in America. 2 days ago, I opened up the New York Times and one op-ed says, well, as we know, non-whites are going to be the majority of Americans in the 2040s. That's not so. And it's not so because the numbers that people use assume that all Latinos are non-white. And when the Census Bureau asks the population, what race do you think you are? Depending on the times, at least 65% of Latinos say that we are solely white. Now, if you look at those numbers in that from that perspective, even in the year 2050, 65% of the American electorate is going to be what we call white. So there's a lot, I think the election helped reveal a lot of assumptions that were questionable. The Democrats come across to many people as seeing the world from the suburban liberal perspective. COVID is a good example. Yes, lives are more important than jobs. Everyone understands that. But it's a different perspective if you can keep on working remotely. If you're a professional or you're connected with some part of the economy that allows you to do that. But in a service economy, where more and more people work, large numbers of people, especially minorities, don't have that option. Yes, if I go to work, I may get COVID, and I don't want that. On the other hand, if I don't go to work and I don't get a paycheck, I know I'm going to be thrown out of my apartment because I can't pay the rent, or I can't pay my house if I can't pay the mortgage. I don't want to push this too far, but states where COVID recently spiked and people thought, oh, wow, these Republican states are going to come over to the other side. They went even more for Trump. The Green New Deal is another. Am I going too long, Cliff? I mean, okay. The Green New Deal is another one. I'm a big supporter of the Green New Deal. It makes a lot of sense from every perspective. New jobs to replace old jobs. But if you're sitting there being asked, well, are you for this? And you hear the Democrats pushed by the environmental movement, they seem much more interested in a carbon-free tomorrow than they are jobs for tomorrow. The assumption is that, well, it's like a little bit like the free trade issue. And that is, working people in America were assured that they'd be better off after NAFTA and after the WTO and after all these trade deals. And when the issue of jobs came up, they were told, not to worry, not to worry, you'll be retrained or whatever. Well, retrained or whatever for a whole lot of people never happened. And they ended up with a lot of industrial areas in this country with a bitterness against Democrats for what they did. You know, there's an assumption that hard times push people to the left because it shows that the capitalist system doesn't work, etc. But on the other hand, in a society with a very thin safety net, and a precarious job market where people no longer have job security, and all they have is their job to hold on to, it's a different story. The question is, when the Green New Deal closes down my factory on Friday, where do I go for a job on Monday? And you look at the language and all the discussion of the Green New Deal, and that's it smells like the trade debate. And that, oh, don't worry about it, you'll be fine. We'll have jobs for you in this new economy, but like what? So it's not surprising that that, to me at least, that the agenda of the left, which is in principle popular with the country, does not translate into political support. Finally, on this, I would say that one of the reasons the left agenda is not does not seem credible to many people is that it depends on government, and the distrust of government has become widespread. In the 1980s, the 1960s, the last time we had a real progressive movement in this country that had power, 80% of the population trusted the government to do the right thing most of the time. That number at the end of the Obama years was 17%, and I'm sure it's a lot lower today after 4 years of Trump. And it's not just right propaganda. As we know, the Carters, the Clintons, the Obamas reinforced that notion of, as Clinton said, the era of big government is over. So what's the result of that? 40% of people on Medicare, when asked, do they benefit from any government program, say no. It's 52% or 53% among student loans. And these are students, right? These are college kids. You'd think they'd get that. Among food stamp recipients, it's about 25%. So, there's this iconic discussion. It was actually real, between a Democratic senator and someone, one of his constituents, I think it was in a supermarket, where the constituent, the elderly person, says, he says, take the government's hands off my Medicare. Don't let the government put its hands on my Medicare. Well, among us informed people, our eyebrows raise, and it shows how stupid the electorate is, et cetera. But that story stops and doesn't go on. The Democratic senator said, yes, I'll keep the government's hands off your Medicare. So the whole political culture has changed, and you cannot have, whether you're a Democratic socialist or a social democrat or just a progressive, you cannot have these changes without, it's a big country, without a big government, and without trust that the government is going to do the right thing most of the time. And we've lost that. So where does that leave us? Well, one lesson of the election is you got to expand the base in the working class. That doesn't mean the racist base, and it doesn't mean the people you'll never get. But there's a whole lot of Americans in the electorate, and not all white, who think that the Democrats and therefore big government can't be trusted. So the question is, how do you make the left agenda credible, given the kind of political stalemate that the country is through? And there's still an urgency for the agenda, which is really a national program for social and economic redevelopment. And unless something like the left agenda happens, the economic life for the working class is going to get worse. And our experience so far is that that doesn't go to the left, it goes to the right. And the possibilities and the threat of fascism will grow. And I don't have to explain about how Trump represents that. So it's going to be harder now than we thought it was. Before the election, it was, oh, we're gonna put Biden's feet to the fire. We're gonna make him do Medicare for all. We're gonna make him do Green New Deal. Well, it doesn't look like for the next 2 years at least any of that is going to happen in a dramatic way. And as a matter of fact, I think that, like it or not, Biden's success, the left depends upon Biden's success. If Biden goes down, we go down. It's a, and what that means to me is that we need to consider ourselves in a popular front, to take a phrase from long ago. And that is, the left needs to be fully supportive of a big economic stimulus to get the jobs rolling again, and federal planning for combating the pandemic. We need to demonstrate that civilian government can work. Because without the public sector, there's no socialism of any kind, except perhaps National Socialism. All right, that's the first thing, that we need a popular front for the next 2 years with Biden on those two major things. Second thing is, I think the left, because this is a long-term proposition, the Green New Deal is going to take a decade or more. And the same is true with most of the other things in the left agenda. And in order to make it succeed, we're going to have a government that's, not only dramatic, but a government that's capable. So I think that young progressives need to think about a career in government, a career in the public sector. And we need to take advantage of Biden to seed the public sector, the federal government especially, with young, smart progressives who essentially are going to be responsible for doing a lot of the work of implementing the agenda. Third thing, I think, because we need, and this will mean a fight within the party. We've got to re-regulate Wall Street, and we have to strengthen the labor movement. I think those two are strategic, long-term issues. We cannot run an economy that's based on real estate speculation and global, super global liquidity in financial markets, and where Wall Street values overcome values of production. And strengthening the labor movement should be a no-brainer. The Democratic Party shot itself in the foot, in the leg, and almost in the heart by abandoning the labor movement to the attacks of Wall Street and the business community. So I think that's going to be a fight, and that's a strategic fight that's worth taking on, as opposed to a lot of smaller things that I think are less important. Finally, and this is a biggie, I think we've got to get on the road towards rethinking and forcing a rethinking of the American role in the world. The deep state foreign policy apparatus is ready to present Biden with a big plan for military spending. And they think that they have earned the reward from Biden because they oppose Trump in so many ways. Now, whether they really opposed Trump or not is another question, but that was certainly the impression they got. And they were helpful in that way. But the fact is, we cannot restore the domestic economy. You cannot have equality, and you can't do what's right for the country and restore U.S. military hegemony in the world at the same time. It just doesn't work. I'm a veteran of what happened in the 60s. And, at one point, Lyndon Johnson said, we can have both guns and butter. We can fight a war on poverty at home and fight a war in Southeast Asia at the same time. Well, it didn't happen. And later, after he was president, I want to read you something that I recently found. Johnson said this, and I'm just giving you a short paragraph. He said, quote, "That bitch of a war, the woman I really loved, the Great Society, all my programs, all my dreams to provide education and medical care to the browns and the blacks and the lame and the poor were gone." It was Vietnam and another round of military spending supporting a renewed grand strategic Cold War with Russia and China is just going to destroy any possibility for progressive movement in the foreseeable future. Now, I understand skepticism about Joe Biden. I have a lot of it myself. And he's not from the left. But remember, neither was Franklin Roosevelt, who gave us the New Deal. He was a Wall Street lawyer who changed because the world that he inherited as president was different. Lyndon Johnson, who gave us the Great Society, was a Southern politician in the pocket of oil and gas interests in Texas, who changed when presented with the face of reality when he became president. So with strategic pressure, it's possible. I'm not predicting anything, but they made progressive programs credible. Let us pray that Biden can do the same thing. Okay, that's enough. I've got 4 more hours if you have time, but
well, I'm sure during the discussion, many of these points that you raised will prompt comments from our viewers. Thank you, Jeff, for that. Now let me turn the floor over to Laura Carlsen, who comes from a different vantage point here in Mexico, a different political culture here. But I think she will want to talk about that as well as about the Hispanic vote in the US. Okay, Laura, if you'll unmute yourself, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Cliff. Well, that's very interesting, and I think it gives us a lot to talk about. Let's see, since the beginning of this election, of course, since the election of Trump, it's been a huge binational issue because of the attacks of Donald Trump on Mexico and later specific policies, particularly on immigrants, but they've had tremendous negative effects here in Mexico. And the polls would show that, I can't remember the exact number, but upwards of between 80 and 90% of the population was very anti-Trump. Then we saw this very close relationship develop between the center-left president, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, that kind of changed many people's views and the political context there. Nonetheless, I think it's been very important you can see organizing efforts here in Mexico to try to support family members in many cases and grassroots organizations in the United States in the effort to get rid of Donald Trump in this election. I'm interested later to talk more about the premise that, again, we're seeing a working class right-wing populist base because I think we need to see some of those numbers come out, not just the exit polls, but when we're able to break it down, I think it's not quite as clear as some of the hypotheses that came out of 2016. And this is particularly true when you look at those minority votes. For one thing, we have the switch, the flip in the Rust Belt states, which would indicate that there was an expanse in the working class base for the Democrats, if not an expansion, at least going back to somewhat the way it was before 2016. So we have to ask ourselves if, what was the momentum behind there? What would the average worker who voted for Trump in 2016 and then did not vote for Trump in 2020, what were the motivations behind that? Because it is true, overwhelmingly true, according to exit polls, that people whose primary concern was the economy did vote for Trump. So we got to break that down somewhat. And then there's also kind of a false narrative about the supposed gains that he made among Latinx population in particular, and among African Americans. For one thing, the main poll that talks about this, which is the Edison poll, has a long history of being off, particularly in those areas of exit polls that have to do with minority voter preferences. So again, we'll have to wait for some of those numbers. And then the other is, and this has been discussed quite a bit lately, the myth of the Latino vote. The myth of the Latino vote is that it's a block, that somehow, it moves monolithically in political terms, and we know that that's not true, and yet we've sort of fallen into the shorthand of talking about the Latino vote without being a little more precise in terms of how we talk about that Latino vote. So when you begin to break it down, what you see is that the Trump's victory in Florida was heavily supported, you could say, by the Latino vote, but it turns out that it was, as predictable, heavily supported by Cubans and Venezuelans and Argentine refugees, mostly from the upper class, capital flight, living in Miami-Dade, and the majority of, for example, up and coming and fairly large Puerto Rican community voted for Biden. And we're beginning to see a lot of breakdowns in those terms. Of course, what happened in Florida also had a lot to do with the failure of the Biden administration to carry out a campaign. In many ways, of the Biden campaign, the Biden candidacy to carry it out. In many ways, they pretty much abandoned Florida, which turned out actually to work electorally anyway, because they just couldn't get it together to reach out to people. And so we know that that has a big impact as well. Then in, excuse me, along the border, we also know that there's a different type of a population among the second and third generation of Mexicans who live there, who, as they say, they didn't cross the border crossed them in many cases, and that they tend to be more conservative. We know that people that were concerned about law and order issues did fall into a lot of that fear rhetoric of Antifa, of socialists, of showing the violence, but only on one side, of minimizing or completely refusing to recognize the violence of neo-fascist groups. It worked in a lot of places and in a lot of different cases. In terms of the Latino vote, of course, the big victory in this election was the sheer quantity of people who voted, because the problem has been that it's always been overwhelmingly Democrat, and it was again overwhelmingly Democrat. I mean, when we talk about an advance, we're talking about a few percentage points in any case, and we're still looking at an overwhelmingly Democratic vote. But it's been a problem that people just don't go out and vote. So they had a pretty low voter turnout. And this time it's estimated that, let's see, some of the figures that are here, is that about 8 million Latinos voted, more than they had in the past election. They're conforming 13% of the electorate, with a total of over 20 million people voting, way above the percentage of people who have voted in past elections. So you have a population that's becoming more democratically involved, and a lot of that has to do with grassroots organizing. I think that that aspect of grassroots organizing, what took place in these elections, is really key to understanding everything, basically to understanding what we can expect in the future, how to deal with the Biden presidency after if we, however we get through this period of uncertainty, as Donald Trump holds on and has another some 2 months in office. And the grassroots organizations had a huge impact. We were in close contact with Lucha in Arizona, with others in different parts of the country, in New York and Washington, national immigrant organizations. United We Dream of the Dreamers, who mostly can't vote, made a huge effort. And then, of course, you also saw Black Lives Matter putting all their political capital of being the largest grassroots mobilization in modern history in the United States. When you add up the people who have been mobilized over the past couple months, which are months of a pandemic, put all that political capital and energy and organizing effort into these elections. And that wasn't just to elect Joe Biden as president. It was to bring forth an agenda. It was basically to say, okay, we're not expecting the revolution if Joe Biden gets to be president. What we are expecting is that we have to get rid of this guy who's in the White House now, because if we don't, basically our lives are on the line. And of course, they're right about that, with the offensive against immigrants, with the families that are being separated, with the different sectors you go through one by one, including women. There are literally lives on the line, as well as an international agenda of the global right that's behind Donald Trump. It's not just that we don't like him. It's not that just that he's erratic and arrogant and misogynist and racist and everything else that is. It's that there's a neo-fascist agenda, a white supremacist agenda that threatens the lives of a huge part of the United States population. So that was basically, the motivating factor for these organizations to go into the elections in a big way. And what it means is that they went into the elections without losing their perspective as grassroots movements, which opens up the possibility, the necessity, and most of them, when you see the declarations that have come out since the elections, are very aware of this, of continuing to be movements on all levels, and certainly not just on the electoral level. This means pushing the government. This means pushing at not just the national level, but the state and local levels as well. It means pushing in terms of grassroots organized, community organizing, and street mobilizations. All the things that we've seen that were then channeled into the presidential elections, and now will be channeled back out again in a different way, in a different confirmation, but without the mega threat of a Donald Trump in the White House. So really the narrative that Latinos voted more for Trump is in many ways a false narrative. More were involved. There were more who voted for them numerically, but we're also seeing a real evolution in terms of involvement and in terms of political participation in that population that we can continue to watch, and we can continue to break down a little bit more as we look at the distinctive populations that make up the Latino vote. The same is true with women in a way. We know that women voted more for Trump than they did in the past. They voted about half and half in the 2016 election, and a majority of women voted for Trump in this election. And this was when, right before the election, everyone was saying women are going to be the downfall of Donald Trump. And he was rushing out to the suburbs to say, please like me, Well, he did much better than many expected there. But again, you have to look at how that breaks down. White women voted for Donald Trump at 55 to 43% from the preliminary exit poll figures. And white men, they voted, wait a minute. Yeah, that's right, sorry. And then white men, of course, voted for Donald Trump. There's a concentration in the rural areas, and there's a concentration among, curiously, and this again would seem to call into question a little the hypothesis that we're looking at a strong right-wing populist working class base. The group that that most strongly voted for Donald Trump were families that made over $100,000 a year. And it broke down pretty evenly below that. Again, we need to get the final figures when we look at it. So this shows us a much more complicated situation than we anticipated. I too was just stuck with that question of how did 70 million people vote for Donald Trump after 4 years of what we've seen happening, and I still don't feel like, you know, I have an answer to it, but there does seem to be a lot to what Charles Blow calls the white patriarchy backlash, which I think is self-explanatory in the name. And the idea that in a context of fear and uncertainty, which is certainly what his presidency generated, people looked to that law and order argument as well, and they looked to hold on to the few, in some cases, privileges that they had. So that means that the groups that had power and certain quotas of power and privilege in a capitalist, racist, and patriarchal society, instead of amplifying their power by making the society less capitalist, patriarchal, and racist, looked to preserve those quotas that they had. And we see this massive white vote, again, you know, for Donald Trump. And we see also men coming out, even among minorities, and voting for Donald Trump in greater numbers that we might have participated in many ways. And I think that does have to do with a patriarchal backlash at this point. On the other hand, you know, the groups, many of the groups and most of the webinars and the discussions, at least that I've been a part of since the elections, are very positive. You know, it was disappointing, the results, in terms of being as close as it was, but there were these success stories like Arizona. There were finally taking back those Rust Belt states. And then there was something that happened on the local grassroots community level that really energized those movements and really gave them an expectation, at least, that there could be a different future for the United States, not just because Trump is gone, because it opened up visions within even the electoral sphere, which is usually pretty, you know, Tweedledee and Tweedledum for most people, in terms of what could change in the country. This is something that's happened under COVID too, as we began to understand what are essential workers and why don't we value them? You know, what is a care economy and why don't we move toward that? You know, we've opened up a lot of discussions that are fundamental for radical change in the country. And this election actually helped to do that as well, despite the fact that Joe Biden is anything but a radical candidate. So like Jenny Monette, a Native American activist in Arizona, called it a narrative shift within the election in terms of who claims the future of the United States. And we saw young people who were organizing in Lucha in Arizona and in places all over the country really radicalized by organizing behind a Biden candidacy, which seems like an irony. And yet it has to do with the movements that have been growing up before them, and the debate, the kind of broadening of that debate in terms of what the country should look like, you know, and how inclusion can include something like, you know, a pretty conservative presidential campaign. Biden's presidency for Latin America, going to what this represents, it's of course not a very positive panorama. We know Joe Biden. We've known him for many years throughout the Obama administration. Joe Biden was the point person for the Obama administration in Latin America, and the result was not good. After promises of self-determination and mutual respect, we saw his direct involvement in the coup. We saw him actually come down and stifle efforts both in Mexico and in the Organization of American States to stop the drug war in defense of this militarized, highly lucrative and extremely bloody approach to counter narcotics. We see in his platform, even now for Central America, he's actually said very little about Mexico itself. We see in his platform on Central America that it is going back to the Biden years. There's no mention whatsoever of political crisis there, despite the fact that in Honduras, the president's been accused of drug trafficking, his brother's in jail, and the corruption scandals have been coming forth on an almost daily basis. And it's basically focused on private sector involvement in the kinds of mega projects that displace people and then cause the immigration that became the wedge issue for Trump's campaigns in both 2016 and 2020, and also for these extremely anti-immigrant measures that his government was famous for. So we do, however, have reason to expect that there'll be a fairly immediate change. He says he learned his lesson when Obama failed to do this right after taking power in 2008 in terms of immigration reform. And that means a lot to a lot of families here in Mexico, in Central America, and in other places. We don't expect that the situation will be resolved. He's likely to have the Senate against him, but he can make a lot of progress just simply undoing many of those measures that Trump did by executive order during his presidency. So we can expect some progress there. And then finally, the part that has to do with Lopez Obrador and his response to this election has been an issue of great debate here in Mexico, as many of you already know. He is one of the few world leaders who has refused to recognize the victory, the electoral victory of Joe Biden. Now we have all the states have counted officially. That adds up to the electoral votes. And Lopez Obrador continues to say that he's going to wait until the legal claims have been settled out, giving validation to Trump's lie that there are actually valid legal claims. When we see that day after day, the lower courts are throwing these out for lack of evidence. There isn't one, except one in Pennsylvania, that had to do with exceeding authority. It didn't have to do with illegal votes or illegal voting processes, that has been granted any legitimacy whatsoever. So he's validating this. He's in the company of only 3 leaders of major countries: Putin, Bolsonaro, and Erdogan. These other 3 are openly supporters of Donald Trump and of authoritarianism. So the argument that this is non-intervention because there's something called the Strada Doctrine here in Mexico that says that you shouldn't intervene in the internal affairs of other countries. And it's a very noble and proper doctrine, but it doesn't say anything about what moment you should recognize an election. And in fact, there have been 8 presidential elections since Lopez Obrador took office, and he's recognized 6 of those before the final official declaration comes out, in all the whole process of certifying elections within those countries. So it's not even a consistent argument, which leaves us with, why is he doing this? And there's a couple of possible answers, and I couldn't even say, for sure which was the real answer. One is that the Lopez Obrador administration really wants Trump to win. And there's actually some evidence with all the open praise you see of Lopez Obrador for Trump. He's suspicious of Biden because of all that the close relationship between the Obama administration and his predecessors at a time when he's trying to make a very marked break between the corrupt rule of Felipe Calderón and Enrique Peña Nieto. And there's also been some rumors about political interest being involved in that relationship as well. We don't really know. The second is that they are afraid of what Trump could do in the next 2 months to Mexico. And so they're figuring they're going to hedge their bets. The Biden administration isn't really going to punish them for doing this, although they are likely to have, from some statements that have come out, a chillier relationship with the Biden administration as a result of being one of the only international holdouts on recognizing and congratulating Joe Biden for his electoral victory. So it's a complicated situation. I think what they're doing is very wrong, that in principle it's wrong, that it's not, in terms of international relations, it's not justified, and that will end up being a very uncomfortable position within the international community, but that's what it is now. And where that leaves us finally as progressive movements is that there are many progressive movements in the United States that feel betrayed by Mexico at this point, especially among Latinos, that can't understand why there would be this effort to give Donald Trump this space to question an election that he clearly lost at the risk of creating this uncertainty in which neo-fascist groups continue to mobilize, they continue to get hyped up, they continue to carry out demonstrations armed in the streets of US cities, in a very, very delicate situation. On the other hand, what it means is not just the decision of Lopez Obrador, but in general where we're at in terms of links between the progressive movements is that we're seeing a lot of conversations, especially between Latinx movements, but also with Black Lives Matter and others in terms of how we can start to bring together domestic and international issues. When you look at most of those issues, except for migration, which has always straddled the border between international and domestic issues, but has been considered a domestic issue in the United States. But when you look at those other issues, there has been very little extension to foreign policy. And so now there's opening up a space to say, look, if we have a care economy, we can't have this kind of a Pentagon budget. If we turn our attention to taking care of people who have been excluded, marginalized, and persecuted, that means that it's not just a resource issue, but we have to change our values, and we have to stop doing the same thing to people abroad. There's a whole series of issues there in which we could start to see some coming together of basic interest between the progressive left movements from both sides, but it's in a very nascent form. And it still will depend first on getting through this period of uncertainty and possible violence still that looms in the United States with what some call the slow coup of Donald Trump refusing to leave office. And then secondly, seeing how a Biden administration sorts out. But to conclude, I would really emphasize that however it sorts out, there's a re-energized grassroots movement in the United States. Many parts of movements in Mexico, although we don't have direct counterparts, are aware that changes are taking place there, not only because of the change in the White House, assuming it takes place as it's supposed to. And that's opening up new territory for new agendas to be put forth, not just on the national agenda and the presidential agenda, but also in those other spaces that have to do with state and local government and in grassroots organizing as well. So I think this is a very positive thing that's come out. I've seen kinds of political discussions I wouldn't have imagined seeing in the United States. It's one of the reasons I left there 30 years ago, because if you were on the left, there was just no room to even have a discussion. And now we're seeing new generations come into that, and we're seeing the issue of racial justice taking a prominent place within that, rethinking of the history, rethinking of the culture, that I think is a very positive sign, both for the United States and for the relationship between the United States and Mexico, especially on the grassroots level.
Well, thank you very much, Laura. Opened up some very interesting and provocative areas for discussion. And I'll want to give Jeff an opportunity to maybe respond to some of your points. But I have a very burning question to pose to both of you. You made extensive use of exit polls, and maybe I'm missing something, but how do you include in exit polling people who are absentee voters? That was a significant part of the electorate this year, and it was heavily Democratic. Is there any way that they are included, or is it only those people who are actually at the polls who get included in exit polling?
No, they did include them this time. The Edson poll used phone calls after the election to ask people how they voted, because they realized that, for one thing, it'd be skewed the same way the election results were skewed, because far more Democrats voted by mail than Republicans did. And for another, there was so many people who voted by mail that you wouldn't have good results. So they integrated that into the methodology.
Yeah, I think that's right. How successful they are in integrating it is another question, but they're trying. And I think that's obviously the whole polling apparatus as a science needs more development. But it is a science, and they're good people trying to figure it out. And I think that it's not too hard to see those kinds of polls that are biased one way or the other. And there's an awful lot of data out there now. The problem is sorting through it. And I think it's going to be a while before we figure out how to with any degree of confidence, identify the quote exit polls of people who don't come into the polls and therefore don't exit.
Yeah, and one of the things, everybody's trying to figure out again how the polls were so wrong after 2016. And I think we have to seriously consider, and it's just a hypothesis, but there's clearly an underreporting of Trump voters in polls. And we have to figure out why that is. And there's always been rumors that there's a strategy of Trump voters not to identify themselves as Trump voters. And then some people say, oh, because they're actually embarrassed, so they say they're not voting for Trump, and then they do. But I think it actually might be more of a strategy, not to identify as Trump voters. What's happened in both elections has been so very dangerous for the Democratic Party is a traditional strategy, which is to lull your opponent into complacency. And if it weren't for the grassroots organizing this time, and it were only up to the Democratic Party, I think that same strategy could have put Trump into the White House again.
Yeah, I think that the sobering part of this, and I'm inspired by what Laura has said about her impressions of what's going on in the movement. My concern is this: I think the mobilization of the grassroots was extraordinary, and that bodes well for the future. On the other hand, so was the mobilization of the right, and it was supposed to be a blowout for the Democrats, because of turnout. And it turned out that, yeah, we turned them out, but they turned them out too. And I don't know how relevant it is, but years ago, when Ronald Reagan was running for governor of California, a friend of mine told me the story that his labor union and the labor movement in general in California had this marvelous campaign. They knocked on all the doors. They got all their people. They made all the phone calls. They'd never seen anything like it before. And they drove all these people to the polls. And they drove their people to the polls. And the people voted for Ronald Reagan. And there's something about the whole process of elections that remains a mystery. I know it remains a mystery to me. I've been at polls where I've worked the whole town for 2 months, and suddenly, and I thought I knew every voter, and all these strangers come in at the end. It's just right that the democratic process should have a mystery to it, I think. But we don't really we misunderstood the other side, and I think that's that. If I could say, I think that's one of the flaws, character flaws of the left, that it gets and I'm just as guilty as anybody else, get full of the excitement of the demonstrations, of the mode of our people. And it's an interesting thing that Laura said about holding back. That I don't know if it's true or not that people on the right are deliberately holding back, but I know that we don't. and if they are holding back, it suggests a degree of conscious or unconscious organization that is that's impressive. So for me, I'm still, the part of me is enthusiastic about what has happened over the last year, and part of me is sober about it, because in the end, the proof of the pudding was, the election, and it certainly did not work as well as we thought. And the other side had I've never met somebody on the right who considered themselves a community organizer. I've met thousands of people on the left, but there's something that they did to organize that community that we should not ignore.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, there
We don't
are,
understand.
Oh, let me say one other thing, if I can, and that
Okay.
is the last part of Laura's presentation about cross-border connections. I just think that if you, in the interest of making foreign policy and domestic policy part of the same politics, and in the interest of getting the United States to pull back from its global hegemony and its adventurism and the possibility of, God, yet another Cold War with some of the same characters. One of the things that's necessary is so what's the alternative? What is the alternative place for the United States in the world if it's not going to be the champion of capitalism and et cetera? And I've felt for a long time that the alternative is a development of our own neighborhood. And that so far has been the purview of the State Department, the sort of Biden experience that Laura was talking about, and not been a project for the American left and in concert with progressives in Central America and Mexico. And I just think that there's a vision that we haven't yet developed that could appeal to a lot of Americans of, hey, what are we doing in all these 180 different places that we've got the military when we've got a huge problem that we've screwed up for the last 150 years here in our own backyard. So I don't know. I don't have a bumper sticker solution for that one, but I really do think it's important.
Well, we want to open the floor to questions and comments from our viewers. And there are some who are viewing this on YouTube. And if that's where you are, you get your questions to us by emailing them to me, global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. So send an email with your question or comment, and I will pass it on then to our speakers. If you are in the Zoom room, and there are a number of you who are right here and able to ask your questions directly, I will put my screen on gallery view so that I can see everybody. And if you have a question or a comment you'd like to raise, just wave your hand at me, and I make sure your camera is on so I can see you waving, and I'll call on you for your to pose your question. Who has the first? Okay, I see Joyce Carlsen, who is identified on her screen as Jorge, but I know you're really Joyce.
This is crazy. Am I muted? No.
No, we hear you.
Way out of, it seems like the whole conversation is based on maybe what you said, Cliff, on Sunday about homo economicus, that everybody's voting rationally and according to their own self-interest. And I've been trying on my own to study moral psychology, and we vote and act and are motivated by our moral foundations and not rationally. We're not rational actors. And if you look at moral foundation theory, which has come out of social psychology and the study of morals, and look at the morals
There's two conversations.
Pardon? That conservative minds have versus more progressive minds, the election results make good sense. And it becomes clear how people voted. They voted on their gut level moral values. And if you go to yourmorals.org, you can find out what your moral foundations are, and you'll find you're all liberal falling off the left side like me. And if you understand their morality of protecting themselves and their family and their kin, and when they're afraid and it hits their amygdala, triggers their amygdala, they'll vote for anybody that's going to build a wall, build up defense, support guns, the whole bit. It's fear, and they're voting from fear. It just goes on, this moral foundation theory that they've come up with, and they've got good statistics on it. And I just wish you guys would study it and help me, and that the left would learn what we need to push and how we need to go forward.
We have
Has
any other?
anybody looked into that at all?
Well, I haven't, I'm certainly no expert on moral theory or probably morals, period. But there's no question that people vote for a variety of reasons, some of which are perceived economic self-interest, some of which is driven by fear. And what makes the whole thing, complicated and mysterious is that there's a mix, and people people within themselves have moral conflicts. William Faulkner once said that the only thing worth writing about is the conflict of the human heart with itself. And I think that that's true for all human beings. It's not, some of them, there's going to be no change in what they're going to do, how they're going to vote on the left or right. But there are people for whom it's a serious question, and they have conflicts within themselves. And at times their fear dominates, at times their hope for the future dominates. And so this is not an intelligent answer to the question, but I don't think it can be either fear or economically driven, or driven by a number of people by the imagery they see on the screen. So I think it's a good contribution. Thank you. I wish I had a clear understanding of it all, but I know it exists, and it exists within people as well as between people.
Yeah.
Laura, do you want to comment on this?
Just really quickly, I think the most important part to understand about the contribution from those studies, and I'm not deeply familiar with them, but is that we have to be very aware of not kind of discarding the motivations behind these people. Anyone who's had a discussion with a loved one on the other side of the spectrum, a Trump supporter, knows that we're talking about people who are good people, who are people who have many of the same values, but they take them somehow in a different direction. And and the closer we come to understanding that, the better off we'll be for obviously expanding our base and everything. And then I wanted to go ahead and take Tim's question on Republicans expanding their vote within Latinx voters through evangelical churches, and if that explains the expansion in the Rio Grande Valley, for example. It's an interesting question. Of course, the evangelicals is the one group with the highest level of support for Donald Trump among any way of kind of categorizing US society. And there are a number of churches, they're strong in Texas in general. It looks like from what's been done so far, there was a Washington Post article and some others, that it looks like what's coming out though as really the main explanation for those votes is that people were concerned about the underinvestment in their region, the lack of infrastructure under democratic governments. The failure of democratic governments for many of those border counties has been important. And then the other one is that there's a lot of oil workers there. So when they see Donald Trump saying full speed ahead for fossil fuels, they feel better about that. And then also what we've known for a long time is that older immigrants or families, actually they're not immigrants anymore, that have been Mexican families in the Southwest for generations. There's sometimes a great mistrust of newer immigrants and of immigration in general, because they have a sense that it's going to rock the boat in terms of what they've been able to attain in terms of security in their lives and for their families. So there's even some anti-immigrant, sentiment sometimes among the Latino communities that have been there for generations before.
We have a couple other hands here. I see Julie Durand raising her hand. The screen name says Cliff Durand, but it's really my wife, Julie Durand. Unmute yourself. What is your comment? And then Gregory, I think, wants to be recognized.
How do you know it's a comment? Laura, congratulations. Wonderful, comprehensive talk. I came in and I didn't hear Jeff, but I'm one that is totally outside of this academic stuff, and Cliff knows that. I don't think I'm a progressive, I'm a radical. And my work in Mexico continues to be amongst the poorest of the poor and communities. I have a comment for the two candidates that the United States presented us, radicals. We had really a lot of us no other choice but to throw away our vote. We did not vote for either candidate. I cannot stand Biden. I hope that he would not have to be our choice. He is not really the Democratic man that I expected to run. I worked hard for Bernie Sanders, who I believe would have been a much better choice. But my comment is, I threw my vote in the trash basket. I don't believe that either candidate would serve the progressive movement in Latin America, let alone people like me that are more radical. That's just my comment. Thank you. If you all want to answer, I would love to hear your answers.
It was certainly a very common response. I mean, obviously we had very high turnout, and so it wasn't that common of a response in the United States, but it's certainly a common response here in Latin America, and it's been a big debate. On the one hand, in the broadest sense of, does it even make sense to participate as movements in elections? And on the other hand, particularly in this one, there's a quote by Raul Sebeki who said that, to think that Biden is better than the fascist Trump is an option that might help make us feel better, and it's sometimes necessary to feel better in a pandemic, especially. But it's completely far unrelated to reality. And I'm surprised how easy it is to fool us into thinking that if Trump's, a fascist, what about Biden, Obama? There's people who have argued that, but I think that they are not taking into account the reality in the United States. They are not taking into account the reality that it makes a big difference in terms of daily survival, whether you have somebody who is likely, and we know how many people Obama deported, but when you add up Trump's deportations, detentions, because he decided instead of just deporting them, I'll make this a business for my buddies and put them into detention centers first. And so that's why, if you add up deportation, detention, and then just not even letting them cross the border, even to make an asylum claim, you have a much stricter immigration policy. So it makes a difference in people's lives. And it's a privileged position to be far from that, to be outside of it, and to be, say a white male political analyst, to say they're both the same. So why should we even care who wins and who doesn't? And I think just the evidence, just the fact that grassroots movements in the United States decided to put so much into this election is proof that, in fact, it does make a difference for their longer term agenda for grassroots social justice.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Laura said. I think that it makes a difference. It makes a life and death difference to many people, and it makes a life difference. That is, what's your life going to be like for many more? It's about a struggle for power. And having, as flawed as American democracy is, I would say, if the whole thing was gone, we'd miss it.
Okay, Gregory, you have a question or comment?
Yes, I have two comments. One, just on this last one, I agreed, was when I add to what Laura and Jeff said, excuse me, which is that the reason I voted for Biden, besides some of the other things that have been said, is it gives one the better chance of the space to organize under progressive issues. And when you don't have to fight certain other battles, it leaves you free to fight these. And so just the battles for survival, which always exists, is there no matter who is president. But I think you have a better chance, under Biden to be able to struggle for a progressive agenda. So that's one. The second, which in some ways is related, is I suppose one could say the class war that is ongoing. Someone's talking in the background. There's an ongoing, obviously there's a class war going on, we all know. However, there's a class war going on within the Democratic Party, obviously. And when you have the Rahm Emanuels and Nancy Pelosi's, if I can use them as on one side, so to speak, and the people in the squad and the grassroots organizers and so forth on the other, we see that intensification with the blame being made on the losses by both sides. And of course, it's very clear that people who were running again basically on a progressive agenda all the way down ballot tended to win their races to the tune of 75% or so. But this is not going to go away. And this fatally weakens the Democratic Party as well, but it's unavoidable. We have to struggle. Whereas the Republican Party, and who knows where that's going to turn if Trump is not still the president, is more organized and more willing to fight in a bare knuckles way. So I'm not really asking a question, but you can address it. I'm just talking about that class war within the Democratic Party and the weakness that it shows. And Jeff spoke a lot about that in terms of its credibility. And I think this is going to increase.
Any further comments about that conflict within the Democratic Party?
Mm.
I'm going to have to get off, so I'll just
Okay.
say real quickly that, yeah, I think it's a great point. And and Trump's talking about coming back in 2024. And we will see, things came to a head this year, but things could really come to a head in that year if we don't take that into account and start, well, I don't know. I definitely do not have a blueprint for the Democratic Party in terms of what to do about it, but it's clearly a serious problem. And if we try to go centrist again in 2024, I don't think progressives, I don't think the country has a chance, basically.
You know
I don't
what?
want to end on that particular note that we don't have a chance. So let me just say goodbye first. And thanks to everybody. It's been a pleasure to be part of the discussion, and I look forward to continuing it.
Laura,
Yeah.
first, I wish you would look at it. These moral psychologists are saying it doesn't have anything to do with a class war. That's rational thinking. It's a moral tribal war. We all belong to moral tribes, and it's individual rights versus the common good. And
that's a big part of it. That's definitely a big part of it. Well, I really do have to, and I think it is, and that's why the whole phrase culture war came up so strongly. I think that that moves into what you're talking about too. And I wouldn't say it's an either or situation between class war or a rational point of view or a moral and more psychological point of view. I think it's something that we have to learn how to analyze as a whole. And I'm afraid I have to leave it there. So
Laura,
thanks again.
we're very appreciative that you were able to spend this time with us and to share your insights. And I wish you best. I would encourage people to go to Laura's website, americas.org, which is the one of the best sources of news and commentary on affairs in Mexico and elsewhere in Latin America as well. That's where she publishes regularly. Thank you again, Laura. Our discussion so far has been focusing on.
Cliff,
Yeah. Yes,
just
sir.
make a comment on this last point. Is it Joyce or Jorge?
Joyce.
Joyce.
And that is, as I said before, I think that there's is an important point here about the complexities of the human mind. But I also think, and I'm that there's a political strategy that keeps pushing the class issue away, and it's a political strategy because the more you can talk about other things, the less you can talk about where the things that disturb the dominant investor capitalist class. There's Wall Street doesn't care about Black Lives Matter. Wall Street doesn't care about brutal cops. They could throw the cops under the bus. What they care about, continuing the system that makes them ever richer and ever more powerful. And there's a danger in dismissing the economics and the class issue in that it gets your eye diverted from, I think, what's a very, very important part of our political problem.
I'm Jorge. I'm here, George.
There's Jorge.
Okay. I wanted to raise another perspective. We've been talking about the national political scene, but I'd like to turn attention to something more local. For the left to move forward during this period, I think we need to think seriously about what we can do at the local level and kind of agenda that can avoid the kind of impasse that we find ourselves in national politics.
Cliff, I'm also going to have to bail out. I thought we were going to 3:30.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe we should save that discussion for another webinar.
It's been great. I really enjoyed being here, talking with you guys, and seeing old friends. So, but by all means, keep up. It was 30.
Well, thank you, Jeff, also for joining us today, and I look forward to your next article. You have anything in the works coming out soon?
Well, I got a couple of things, yeah, and you'll be one of the first to know.
Okay, good. Well, if you email it to us, we pass it on to our email list.
Thanks. Take care now.
All right, thank you all, and I want to point out that we have other webinars coming up. Next Monday, we will have a webinar on the environmental crisis, radical responses to the environmental crisis, including Fred Magdoff, Victor Wallace, and Mauricio Betancourt, who will be speaking to us. In following weeks, we also have a webinar on Medicare for All, featuring Margaret Flowers, who's been very active in the Medicare for All field. On December 7th, Pearl Harbor Day, we have the historian Peter Kuznick talking about the dangerous myths surrounding World War II and how they've contributed to the existential crisis facing humanity today. Um, and as we move into the new year in January, we have lots of other exciting webinars in planning stages. So stay tuned and we'll be sure that to let you know about them. Well, right now, I want to thank you all for your participation and point out that since the coronavirus hit, we have all of our revenue programs have been canceled, and yet we continue to pay our Mexican staff. And so we urge you to make donations. You can do so by going to the website globaljusticecenter.org. We'd be happy to have your donations. And we look forward to seeing you in future webinars. But for now, this is Cliff Duran signing off.
I came in late. Oh, I didn't hear. Yeah. When I got back from showing,
Oh, you didn't hear him?
yeah, no,
Uh-huh.
but she was very